This lecture will cover the second part of Chapter 14. At the very end of Part 1, we defined net filtration pressure, so we're going to continue on talking about that. And net filtration pressure is the difference between net hydrostatic pressure and net colloid osmotic pressure. So to get net hydrostatic pressure, we have the blood hydrostatic pressure, and we subtract the hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid. But we know that this is nothing, right? So this is going to equal 0. And we can see here blood hydrostatic pressure minus interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure. So this here will give us our net hydrostatic pressure. And to get our net colloid osmotic pressure, we have blood colloid osmotic pressure minus the interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure, which we said is low, so between 0 and 5 millimeters mercury. So here we can see blood colloid osmotic pressure, and we're subtracting the interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure. Okay, so this will give us our net colloid osmotic pressure. As we draw this out and calculate the net filtration pressure, we can see that it changes along the length of the capillary, and it's going to be higher at the arterial end. Okay, so if we have this positive number, a higher net filtration pressure, that means that the hydrostatic pressure, or the push, is going to be greater than the colloid osmotic pressure, or the pull. So we know that favors filtration, and we know that filtration occurs at the arterial end. Now, as we move towards the venous end, now the pull is greater than the push, so our net filtration pressure is going to be a negative number, and this is going to favor reabsorption, which we know occurs at the venous end. When in doubt, draw it out. So let's put everything together and draw it out and prove what we've learned to be true. So we can start by drawing our capillary. So over here we have the arterial end. And then we're going to head on over to our venous end. Okay, and we know the flow of blood. So blood is leaving the heart through the arterial system, right, through the capillaries where we're going to have gas and nutrient exchange, and then returning back to the heart through the venous system. All right, so now we can add those forces that we talked about. So our hydrostatic pressure, which again we can think of as the push, and our colloid osmotic pressure, which we can think of as the pull. So over here on the arterial end, we have blood hydrostatic pressure. And remember, this is the force that the fluid exerts on the vessel wall. Okay, so over here on the arterial end, this is going to be around 35 millimeters of mercury. But then out in the interstitial space, we have interstitial fluid. So we have the hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid. But we said this isn't contained, so the force is not going to be great In fact, it's going to be equal to 0. So we can calculate our net hydrostatic pressure, and it's going to be equal to our blood hydrostatic pressure minus the interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure. And this is going to give us 35. Okay, so now we have our net hydrostatic pressure, but we also have this opposing force, so the pull. So we have our blood colloid osmotic pressure. Okay, because we have these plasma proteins that, right, because of osmosis, water is going to be pulled in towards the plasma proteins. So our colloid osmotic pressure is going to be 26. But we also have colloid osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid. Right? But again, these plasma proteins, we don't have their presence out in the interstitial fluid. So this number is going to be relatively small again. So between 0 and 5, let's just say 5. So now we can calculate our net colloid osmotic pressure, or oncotic pressure, which is going to be equal to 26 minus 5, which is going to be 21 millimeters mercury. Okay, so now we have our net hydrostatic pressure and our net colloid osmotic pressure. So now we can calculate the net filtration pressure. And our net filtration pressure is going to be net hydrostatic pressure minus net colloid osmotic pressure. So this number here, our net filtration pressure, is positive, which means that the push, the hydrostatic pressure, the force, the push, is going to be greater than the pull. So we're going to be pushing fluid and dissolved solutes out. Okay, which there's a term for this that we know, right? This is filtration. So now we can see that filtration, right, occurs at the arterial end. Okay, so we're pushing fluid and dissolved solutes out. Where does that fluid go? Well, it's either going to be pulled back in, or we have a lymphatic vessel. It doesn't look like one, but right, structures of our lymphatic system that pick up that fluid, scan it, and return it to the blood, right? Return it into circulation. All right, so now let's move over to the venous end. Okay, so again, let's look at hydrostatic pressure first. So over here, we had, right, 35 millimeters of mercury. But now we've pushed out a lot of fluid. Okay, so there's not going to be quite as much force against the vessel wall because that fluid now is out in the interstitial space. So our blood hydrostatic pressure against the wall over here on the venous end is going to drop a little bit. Okay, so let's say 16 millimeters mercury. But still, even though there's more fluid in the interstitial space out here, it's still not contained. Some of it's going in the lymphatic system, and there's a lot of space. So the force is, again, going to be 0. So we can say interstitial fluid, hydrostatic pressure is still equal to 0. So now we can calculate our net hydrostatic pressure, which is going to be 16. Okay, so the plasma proteins didn't go anywhere, so our blood colloid osmotic pressure is still going to be the same, the pull. So we can say blood colloid osmotic pressure, which is the pull, is the same. Okay, and same out here, right? There's much less, so between 0 and 5. So we'll just use 5 again. And now we can calculate our net colloid osmotic pressure, or oncotic pressure. Okay, so now we have what we need to calculate net filtration pressure. Okay, so net filtration pressure down here at the venous end is going to be 16, right? Our net hydrostatic pressure minus 21, or our net colloid osmotic pressure, which is going to equal -5. So what does this tell us? That the pull is greater than the push, right? There's more force coming from colloid osmotic pressure pulling fluid back in than there is hydrostatic pressure, force against the vessel wall, pushing fluid out. Okay, so now we're going to have reabsorption occurring at the venous end. Okay, so just to avoid any confusion, this net filtration pressure, when it's a negative number, this can also be calculated differently and called net reabsorption pressure, which would be the same thing, right? It's going to show us that reabsorption is promoted down here at the venous end. But this is what our textbook uses, so I'm going to say net filtration pressure, and the negative number is promoting reabsorption. The positive number is promoting filtration. And of course, we can follow that with a much nicer picture from the textbook, but drawing it out really will help make sense out of everything. So here we can see the same thing. We have our arterial end and our venous end. Okay, and we can see the flow of blood, and as it travels through, we're going to have filtration because the blood hydrostatic pressure is greater than the colloid osmotic pressure. And as we lose some of that fluid, the net hydrostatic pressure is going to decrease. So when we get down here at the venous end, right, fluid's going to be drawn back into the vessel because our colloid osmotic pressure is greater than the blood hydrostatic pressure, right? That's why we have this negative net filtration pressure. So we can see here reabsorption happening at the venous end and filtration happening at the arterial end. Some terminology to go with what we've been talking about is edema. So edema is this excess accumulation of interstitial fluid. Okay, so many things can lead to edema. The common ones are high arterial blood pressure, which if we think about it, is going to make sense because that hydrostatic pressure, that pushing force, is going to be greater, much greater than what we've been looking at. So reabsorption is not being effective enough to pull all that fluid back in, right? Because the that outgoing force is so great. Okay, leakage of plasma proteins into the interstitial space. Well, now if we have those plasma proteins out in the interstitial fluid, we're going to have a greater colloid osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid. Okay, so again, then we're going to be drawing fluid out into the interstitial space. Okay, decreased in plasma protein concentration. So again, affecting blood colloid osmotic pressure. That pull back into the capillary, back into the venous end of the capillary, is not going to be as strong. And then obstruction of the lymphatic vessels. Okay, so if the lymphatic system isn't picking up that fluid, that will become lymph and then be returned into the circulatory system, then it can accumulate out in the interstitial space. So moving on now through the rest of chapter 14, we're going to look at blood volume and blood pressure and regulation of blood volume and blood pressure. So a lot of these terms are going to sound familiar, like antidiuretic hormone or aldosterone, because we have talked about them in the endocrine system. So we're going to go now into more detail about things that regulate blood volume or blood pressure. And I do just like to sort of throw it out there that these terms come back again in Unit 5 when we're in the urinary system. And then we go into even more detail. So it's important to sort of keep your notes or just know that it's coming back. It's not something to just regurgitate for the test because we're going to learn it again in Unit 5. So the more you can remember from Unit 4 and Unit 3, the better. Okay, so let's start by defining blood volume. So blood volume is the total amount of fluid in the arteries, capillaries, veins, and heart. Okay, and blood volume, we're going to see, has a relationship with blood pressure. So if we have an increase in blood volume, we're going to have an increase in blood pressure. Okay, so what we've been looking at is that we have these forces, right? We have hydrostatic pressure, colloid osmotic pressure, and these different forces control the movement of water between the interstitial space and the capillaries. Okay, so how much water we bring into the blood is going to affect blood volume, right? So these are going to affect blood volume. So what we'll really go into when we get in the urinary system is also how the urinary system affects blood volume, right? So if we urinate more, we're getting more water out of the body. This is going to decrease blood volume. But if let's say we increase our water intake, so we drink more and we urinate less, right? Now we have increase, so we're going to have an increase in blood volume. Okay, so urine formation and water intake can play a role in regulation of blood volume. So urine formation can have an impact on blood volume, and urine formation is going to begin when blood is filtered through glomeruli, which are the functional units of the kidney. Okay, so here we have a glomerulus. Blood is going to go through and be filtered, and some of that filtrate, or what is pushed out, will be reabsorbed. Okay, so more of that in Unit 5. But the amount of fluid that's reabsorbed back into the blood is going to be controlled by several different hormones and also by the sympathetic nervous system. All right, so our control centers, the endocrine system and the nervous system. We'll start with antidiuretic hormone, which we did just talk about in Unit 3 and the endocrine system. So antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, let's recall, is produced by the hypothalamus, but then it is stored and released from the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so we can have a change in plasma osmolality. So let's say that we have excessive increase in dietary salt and we're not keeping up with how much water we should be drinking. Okay, so dehydration. Well, that's going to lead to an increase in plasma osmolality or blood osmolality. So what does that mean? Right? If we have increased this means that we have less fluid and more solutes. Okay, so this can be a stimulus to release antidiuretic hormone. And let's see what antidiuretic hormone is going to do, or the hypothalamus, right? Hypothalamus can stimulate thirst. So now we're going to consume more water. Antidiuretic hormone is going to stimulate water reabsorption. So we're pulling more water back into the body that would have been released as urine, right? So we're decreasing urine output. So when we have increased water intake, less water leaving the body as urine, now we have an increase in blood volume. Okay, so if we have an increase in blood volume, if we think about our initial stimulus, okay, an increase in blood volume, negative feedback loop, right? Release of antidiuretic hormone. This is now going to be a decrease in blood osmolality. Right? So we're going to have more fluid within the blood. So increase in blood volume. So we'll draw it all out and talk about the specifics of antidiuretic hormone. All right, so let's draw out our feedback loop regarding antidiuretic hormone. So we can go ahead and put antidiuretic hormone up here so we don't forget what we're talking about. And we know when we look at feedback loops, there's a stimulus. This is a negative feedback loop. So the outcome is going to be in the opposite direction. So what is our stimulus? Right? Maybe we are not consuming enough water. Maybe we're eating excess salt. So we could have dehydration, increase in salt intake. And what's this going to do to plasma osmolality? Right? We're going to have an increase Okay, so if we think about feedback loop, now this is going to be detected by something. So this is detected by receptors in the hypothalamus. Okay, so our control center. And the hypothalamus is going to stimulate the release of antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, we're also going to have the stimulation of thirst. Okay, so you're really thirsty, you go drink water, right? So we have an increase in water intake, which leads to an increase in blood volume. Okay, so now back to ADH release. So antidiuretic hormone is going to function on the kidneys, and this is going to increase water reabsorption or water retention. And decrease our urine output. So what effects are these things going to have on blood volume? Both of these are going to increase blood volume. Okay, so now we have an increase in blood volume. So our outcome or our result is going to be opposite of the stimulus. Okay, so now we have decrease in plasma osmolality. Okay, and this is antidiuretic hormone. Aldosterone is the next hormone we're going to look at. So let's just review what we said about aldosterone and introduce some new information. Then we're going to take this and look at it as part of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Okay, so back in the beginning of Unit 3, we said aldosterone is released from the adrenal cortex. And we said that aldosterone promotes sodium retention and potassium secretion. So this is true, and we will go into those details in Unit 5. But let's think for a second. If we're pulling sodium ions, right, back into the body, chloride ions are going to follow and create salt. So aldosterone leads to the retention of salt. Okay, so aldosterone is going to stimulate sodium chloride reabsorption. Right, so we can just call it the salt retaining, retaining, there we go, hormone. Okay, so if we are retaining salt, what's going to follow? We're going to retain water. So aldosterone indirectly stimulates the retention of water. Unlike antidiuretic hormone, where, right, this had a direct impact on water retention. So this is an indirect impact on water retention. So aldosterone indirectly stimulates water retention. Okay, so we just went through antidiuretic hormone and we saw this change in plasma osmolality. So with aldosterone, we're not going to see that change, right? Because we're retaining both solutes and water. So they're being retained together. Okay, so another difference between aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone. Okay, so aldosterone can be released during times of salt deprivation or when we have low or decreased blood volume or decreased blood pressure. Because if we think about this, if we have low blood pressure and we increase our salt retention, increase our water retention, that is going to increase blood volume, which is going to increase blood pressure. All right, so let's look at aldosterone in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. This is our RAS, right? Renin, oops, I need a pen. Renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. So when blood pressure is low, this is going to be our stimulus, and this is going to be detected by the kidney, right? Because blood is going to be filtered through the kidney. So when there's a decrease in blood flow through the kidney, it's detected by specialized cells within the kidney. Okay, so this is another example of something that is going to come back in full force in Unit 5 when we talk about the kidney. Okay, so we have this decrease in blood flow through the kidney. It's detected by these specialized cells in the kidney, and the kidney is going to release renin. So renin then is going to convert angiotensinogen, which is released by the liver, into angiotensin 1. Then angiotensin 1 is circulating. It's going to travel through capillaries within the lungs, and angiotensin 1 is going to be converted into angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. And then angiotensin 2 is going to function to increase blood pressure. Okay, so angiotensin 2 can stimulate thirst in the hypothalamus, can cause vasoconstriction, which is going to increase resistance, which is going to increase blood pressure, and it's going to stimulate the production and release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. So we have our renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. And all of this, right, that we just went through is going to increase blood pressure. All right, so when in doubt, draw it out. Let's do that. All right, so let's put what we're looking at, right, and that is the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Okay, so again, this is a negative feedback loop. So we're going to see the outcome that's going in the opposite direction of the stimulus. So let's start by identifying our stimulus. And our stimulus is a decrease in blood pressure. And this stimulus can be detected by specialized cells within the kidney. Okay, so we have our kidney here. And when we have a decrease in blood pressure, we're going to have a decrease in blood flow through the kidney. So these specialized cells, these receptors in the kidney, can detect this decrease in blood pressure and stimulate the kidney to release renin. Okay, so renin is an enzyme, and this enzyme, renin, is going to convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Okay, So we had a decrease in blood pressure detected by the kidney. Kidney is going to release renin. Renin is going to convert angiotensinogen, which is a protein molecule from the liver. And angiotensinogen is going to be converted by renin into angiotensin 1. So now angiotensin 1 is in the circulatory system, and when it gets to capillaries in the lungs, there is an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme. Or ACE. An angiotensin converting enzyme, based off its name, well, we can make an educated guess that it's going to convert angiotensin. An angiotensin converting enzyme is going to convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Now, angiotensin 2 is going to have a number of effects to increase blood pressure. So let's start with angiotensin 2 on its own. Okay, so angiotensin 2 can cause vasoconstriction. And when we have vasoconstriction, think, right, we have all this fluid moving through here, and now we've reduced the diameter of the lumen, right? So this is going to increase the resistance of the fluid or the blood moving through it and increase blood pressure. Okay, so now we have increase in blood pressure. But angiotensin 2 also will stimulate the synthesis and release of aldosterone. Okay, and aldosterone, can put our little adrenal gland here. Aldosterone's coming from the adrenal cortex. And so now we have the release of aldosterone, and aldosterone is going to have an effect on the kidney, and it's going to stimulate salt retention, which is going to indirectly stimulate water retention. When we have an increase in water retention, we're going to have an increase in blood volume, which is going to give us an increase in blood pressure. Okay, so now we have our result, which is an increase in blood pressure, which is in the opposite direction of our stimulus. Okay, so here is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. One more time, the image from the book. I like mine much better, but that is okay. We can go through this as well. So, right, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. We can see our stimulus. We have a decrease in blood pressure, which means we're going to have a decrease in blood flow through the kidney, which can be detected by the specialized cells in the kidney that we'll talk about in Unit 5, but they will stimulate the release of renin. Now, renin is the enzyme that's going to convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, which will then be converted into angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme. And angiotensin 2, we can see, leads to vasoconstriction, which is going to increase our blood pressure. But angiotensin II will also stimulate the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, which is going to increase salt and water retention and increase blood volume, which will increase blood pressure. So again, we have a result in the opposite direction of our stimulus. And after going through the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, now we can make sense out of what an ACE inhibitor is. So an ACE inhibitor, before we look at the definition, right, is going to inhibit angiotensin converting enzyme. So remember that angiotensin converting enzyme converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And if we don't have that, then we're not going to have vasoconstriction caused by angiotensin 2. We're not going to have the release of aldosterone. We're not going to have the increase salt and water retention. We're not going to have the increase in blood pressure. So ACE inhibitors are drugs that prevent this conversion of angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, which can, prevent increase in blood pressure. So ACE inhibitors, lisinopril is an example of an ACE inhibitor, is blood pressure medication used to treat hypertension or high blood pressure.